Um, the origins of the project are located in the two things. One, my own interest in music, particularly in black music, and the ways I think scholars don't take black music seriously. That we use it as a prop to explain social or cultural phenomena, but that there are very few scholars. Fred is obviously one. Ronald Judy is another, who take the music on its own terms and who try to think about black music as a language that is expressive of the black human experience. And that has an aesthetic, that has a set of relationships to black life, but also is one of the most critical forms of human expression that we have in human civilization. And so my thought was how can we think about this? The second genesis or push impulse is located in a feeling that I have that there is a black world. It's African American, Caribbean, Latin American, in continental Africa, as well as Europe, black folks in Europe. And I'm not saying that there's this common experience that obfuscates all differences and historical specificities. But I believe and I think that there is a historical experience of blackness which has created a ground for certain understanding and a certain set of relationships that are necessary, I think, for black folks internationally. I have relationships to South Africa. I've had that since the elections, but as a scholar since I was there as a visiting professor in a project at the University of Cape Town, where the project I conceived with my colleagues was how to think Africa differently. And we had an amazing conference and a subsequent sequel to that. So I have a relationship to South Africa, and I've always felt South Africa was an important element of the black world. And my first wife is South African, and my son is therefore part South African. So I've always felt a kind of affinity to South Africa in many ways. And so because I had this relationship to South Africa, this time to University of Joburg, I felt that it was important to do that project there, to make it a project of both Brown University and University of Joburg, VIAD. Perhaps there's a third element which I think is important, because you are the ones doing the project, is that the project started out with us discussing, what I would call the older heads discussing this. But it became clear to me fairly quickly that if the project was to have any creative juice to it and be distinctive, it needed to be in the hands of younger people. And so, with discussions obviously have veered, I thought about who could be the younger folks. Notice I never said junior, the younger folks who could make a contribution and who would bring a distinctive style and a set of inquiries and questions to the project that those of us who are older heads could not bring to it and would not be able to bring to it. And so those three things are, I think, are the kind of grounds for the project. The language Black Sonic, I began with thinking around questions of what the Sonic is, and both of you would have heard this. Is it a language? Is it a grammar? Then it remained that way. But then you, all of you, Melaine, yourself, Will, Louis, Michelle, all of you have taken it off into other directions, which I can only read about. And so it is not, Black Sonic is like a catalytic language and naming of the project, but I'm not sure it is actually the project itself now, the directions you have all taken it. We have to circle around two words, heritage and heresy. Heritage is usually considered to be tradition, a way in which tradition is consolidated into some kind of normative dominance ideas, cluster of ideas about a society, about life, about culture. That becomes our so-called heritage. About ideas. So you get adverbs that qualify. So our intellectual heritage or cultural heritage. And it's always about the tradition. But the problem with heritage is that heritage, to become for something, to be a set of ideas or a set of practices to become heritage and to be labeled as heritage, what has to happen is that it has to become dominant. In other words, there has to be a process of power that operates, that then configures something into actual heritage itself. Heresy, on the other hand, draws a lot from the ways in which you challenge orthodoxy. So heritage can actually become orthodoxy as it consolidates and sinks into tradition and to kind of unquestioning tradition. Because there's always tradition. So the question is, when do you have unquestioning tradition? When do you have a tradition that is not open? At what moment does a tradition become closed and then consolidates itself into heritage and then becomes dominant? And people say we are operating within this particular tradition. What heresy does is that it looks at the tradition and opens the tradition space, opens the heritage space. Heresy then says, okay, no tradition is stable. No heritage is stable. All heritages are consolidated by a series of discursive power and political powers. So heresy challenges that and says, okay, within the consolidation of that tradition or of that heritage, what are the currents that actually have been counter to that, to what we consider to be the tradition? What are the ways in which the actual tradition or the heritage has been consolidated by itself? So it looks at what? It looks at the ways in which power has consolidated itself, so the functioning and process of power, but it also tries to rupture the configuration by trying to understand what are the other currents that have been either silenced or erased. And so heresy is about finding the ways to think about and to see and play with and to bring and to foreground those currents that have been what? That have been silenced, that have been erased, that have been marginalized within the so-called framework of heritage. So when I see heritage, I say, yeah, okay, that's tradition as far as I'm concerned. But when I see heresy, I say, okay, I see what you are doing is that you're actually calling heresy, you are calling tradition, and you're calling heritage to order. And you are saying that is not everything. There's something else. Yeah, a couple of things. One is, when I began to think about heresy, I actually began to think about it not from the history of the church, but I began to think about it in relationship to Du Bois's Souls of Black Folks. That's actually when I began to think about it. Although in a series of letters Winter wrote me subsequently, after she saw the usage in Black Heretics, Black Prophets, she went back to the church, but and to the religious conception and so on. And I kept, no, I understand, I myself have that background, but what I'm trying to do is to think with Du Bois. And I'm trying to think with Du Bois in relationship to double consciousness and second sight. Because what I argue is that what Du Bois says is that African American has this split and so on, and problems with double consciousness, that where you see yourself, but you see yourself in the eye, through the eyes of another. So there's no what he calls true self-consciousness. They're Hegelian, obviously, working through some Hegelian concepts of self and recognition. But he also goes on to say the African American has a second sight. And to me, the second sight is important. Because what the second sight does is that it actually allows you to see inside the dominant. The second sight allows you, because you are not a citizen, you are not totally embedded in the dominant structure. Right? You're outside of it. You use Winter's words, you're actually liminal to it. And being liminal to it means what? Means that you have a capacity to see the structure in the way, and the society in a way in which other people cannot see it. Or it takes them a little while to see it. Not that they can't see it. And so that the heresy that I began to think about was the heresy that comes from the second side. In other words, that comes from the capacity for you to penetrate into the society and to see its weaknesses, to see its fault lines, to understand its exploitation, its exploitative nature, to understand how it dominates people, and so on and so. In other words, it is that second sight that allows one to do it. Now, if you are intellectual, then you are trained within all the protocols of the West. And so therefore, you can have double sight, second sight. But for you as an intellectual to continue to have second sight, you actually have to commit heresy, because you have to then overthrow the orthodoxy that you have been trained in. So that in terms of intellectual life, the question of heresy is about the overthrowing of orthodoxy. It's the overthrowing of the dominance. But it is building up on second sight. It's not that you just get up one morning and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. It is actually building upon the contradictions, the problems, the ways in which the society operates that you can see, because it is related to blackness. Okay. How is it related to blackness? To come back to second sight, it is because of blackness, not because you are racially black as a phenotype, but because of the historical relationship of blackness to the society that then allows you to have that second sight. Blackness, however, is but one figuration, because racial capitalism, let's call it that, from the history of secular colonialism to racial slavery to the present, creates people who are always, or human populations, because that's the nature of capitalism, who are always outside of. The logic of this system is to always create disposable bodies. But the logic of the system, because it is not just capitalism pure, but it is a racial capitalism, to use that phrase, means that the historical blackness has a special signification. Now, what that means is the following things. One, that you can have a black figure, phenotype black, but who is integrated in the system as he or she goes to all the dominant institutions and absorb the system. And you have all sorts of confusion. I was watching a documentary somebody sent me last night, and I couldn't stop watching it even though I had other work to do, because they were interviewing this black man from South Carolina who had wrapped himself in the Confederate flag and who was standing up on a bridge in South Carolina proclaiming his love for the South. And this wasn't 500, 200 years ago. This was like 6 months ago. And I was trying to understand this figure, I'm going to use about 65, what it is that would allow somebody like that in South Carolina today to do that, wrap himself in the Confederate flag, as then talk about the South as the North not understanding the South, and how, in fact, the South needed to have, the South, the race relations in the South, in his words, were much better than the North, and they should just have left us alone. Okay, those are his words, not mine.
I think it's just emotion.
So what you have, therefore, in racial capitalism, and it's because if you follow Winter fairly closely, is that you will, the point that she's making about us as not just biological but cultural beings, following Fanon, but also then becomes narrative beings, is that people tell themselves a certain set of stories. One of the dominant stories that people are told in racial capitalism, black people, is that you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Those persons that pull themselves up by the bootstraps, that get into Harvard, etc., and I'm not saying that everybody does, right? Becomes, in my view, the figure of the Negro. That figure of the Negro is a figure that is now acceptable to white society, to racial capitalism. That figure of the Negro, even though he or she may have one foot in blackness, is really has all of his or her life deeply embedded in racial capitalism and white supremacy. And you can see that figure of the Negro, particularly when he or she talks about ordinary black people, how they address them, how they think about black men as being irresponsible, how they think about what they call the culture of poverty or the culture of crime or the culture of this. Right? In other words, beginning to identify those who are black outside of on the margins, begin to identify in the language of the actual system itself that structurally put black folks, the vast majority of black folks on the margins. So those persons become in my view, becomes what I call the Negro. Right? Those persons do not commit heresy. Those persons accommodate themselves and integrate themselves with a certain tinge of coloring, if you want to put it that way, which the system can, in my view, is elastic enough to support and have them, make them gatekeepers or look at them in certain ways. But the society is deeply anti-black. So that even when these Negroes find themselves inside the system, they also find that they become a point of antagonism. So hence you have an Obama. And President Obama becoming the catalyst for the emergence, the public emergence of right-wing and white supremacy. Not that these things had died out, but his being president opened up the door, or opened up the closet for those who were in the closet to come forward. So that, because again, the society is deeply anti-black. So you have to begin. It's complicated. It's not, it's not one thing or the other. Okay, so how then does this business of blackness operate? I would then want to suggest that not in opposition to, but separate from, an alternative to, is that there emerges a figure in which he or she accepts blackness, not as disposable lack of or inferiority, but transforms blackness into something else. And that transformation is, in my view, the point of heresy, where heresy begins. It transforms. You begin to think of it as the blackness producing music. You begin to think of it producing art, producing this, producing political ideas, producing all those kind of things. Not because people are black, but because the historical situation of blackness has led people in practice to do certain things. I really want to make that point, because I'm not saying this is not an essentialist argument. It's an argument, it's a historical argument about what blackness produces because of the way in which people are located in society, and how therefore black folks then flip the script, and in flipping the script accept the blackness and then transform it into a different terrain. And they do it and create this different terrain, not to the exclusion of other people, but as in fact trying to develop a different mode of being human, which other people can join if they so wish. Music becomes one side of that in the most extraordinary way. And so when and it is this song I always say to people, if you want to hear what I'm talking about, is that you take Cyndi Lauper's Time After Time, nice British singer, and then you take Miles Davis's playing Time After Time, and any of the concerts that he does in Europe, and you will hear the difference. You will see the ways in which Davis, who's a misogynist person and so on, but the way in which he actually takes that trumpet and replays Time After Time and make it something else. So my point is the heresy is about the actual making of something else. And the making of something else is also a set of practices. And particularly in music, it is that practice. And you listen to, one listens to Coltrane playing, and you listen to him playing, and then you listen again, and you suddenly realize that he's actually playing different notes even in the same song. Right? So there's never repetition, quite frankly, in what he's doing. And you listen to Miles playing Time After Time so different times as I have, and it is different in each time. So that what you are looking at, therefore, is not repetition, but it is always the creation of the new. What Fanon would say, the constant invention. And music is that site of that constant invention, more than, I would argue, anything else. Both music and dance. Painting is much more complicated, but both music and dance, I would argue, are sites of that constant invention. This question I'm naming is a very difficult question. And I'm on the fence about it. I don't think, and Will in particular can correct me here, I don't get a sense that artists name what they are doing. I get a sense that it is the critics and the scholars who do the naming. And that what musicians do is that they just play. And they hear the sounds and they hear the music and then they play it. Okay? What we do is that we who are not so fortunate, lesser mortals, we name it. We study it and we name it. Okay? The problem with naming something is that as soon as you name something, you close it. But I understand the need for classification. You see what I'm saying? Which is part of naming. That's why I said I'm on the fence. But I'm also aware that every time you name something, you close it, and something else escapes. Okay. And because if you live under neoliberalism, which is already gone down, one of the drives of this system is to, and you would have heard me say this before, is that it is actually to capture the desire and the imagination of people. And in capturing the desire and imagination of people, what it has to do is that's the name then got the actual radical element of what they are naming and then give you back it in a palatable form that has to do with, that has to do with the dominant structures. And so it's hard to escape that, particularly if you are a musician and you say, okay, I want to make it, or, I want to go to the studio. I mean, the social media and the new technology might give you more spaces to manage. But, I was listening to about 4 weeks ago, the Prince's posthumous album that he did, that was just released after he died. And I was listening to the lyrics of it, and I was thinking, I wonder why some of this couldn't have been released, right, when he was alive. I wonder if he himself understood, like a song that then says, this is a slave society. I mean, that, if that doesn't, and that's a song that is lyrics that critique commodification and so on. And I thought, I wonder if he himself knew that he couldn't release this at this moment, even though he has his own company and whatever, and had all these, and he was a big artist, put it that way, with a certain leeway. So I think that this business of not finding yourself caught within the vortex of neoliberalism is a difficult one, because the artist, he or she, also has to live. I'm not silly enough, I'm a scholar, I get paid for Brad Brown. So I don't have to, and I have tenure, I don't have to worry about day-to-day living. But if it's an artist who wants to be true to his or her work, he or she also has to think about, okay, how do I live? And this idea of somehow of the genius who walks barefooted, I don't agree with in the 21st century, right? And the geniuses, the musical geniuses, the so-called European musical geniuses, they don't walk barefoot. Beethoven and Bach and Mozart all had the people who were their sponsors. So please, this is a kind of myth that goes around. So I would not want, so people have to live. So, okay, so what's the navigation process? That's the point. And how do you work with the big labels if you have to? while at the same time trying to keep, keep a true, and I hate that word, but trying to keep to what it is you understand your art to be and what you want it to be. And that's a difficult situation, and I'm not sure, there are a couple of artists I think who have done it. I think Curtis Mayfield did it, for example. I think Prince did it to some extent. I think there's a folk singer whose name slips me. She's from South Carolina at the moment, who's attempting to do that. I think there are a group of another sort of artists, younger people, who are doing it by only playing at clubs and then trying to earn a living that way, and then occasionally going to the studio when they have enough money to do the time, and they don't have to be everything doesn't have to be done at the demands of the studio and so on. So Malay, you've asked the toughest of questions, and you have asked the toughest of questions because people live, and people have to live. Right? People have to live. People have families to feed. They have responsibilities if they want to, which they need to take care of and so on. And if they want to just do their music, then they have to find ways in which they have to find a way to navigate the structures that allow that to happen. Right? And so it is a really complicated question. So you're not even sure. Sometimes you're not even sure what people are doing, quite frankly, when you listen to them. So I hear, so D'Angelo, for example, I know people like, but I've listened to him carefully and I say, I wonder if there's not something that's going on here, right? That we need to pay attention. Not as a critique of him, but, as a negotiation that he has to go through. And the negotiation is not now just with the big studio. The negotiation is also, how do I make myself legible within the genres that have been constructed by the dominant. So that is also something that people have to play around with, because there's not many people who actually create a new genre. Again, you see, the business of the prophets and the prophetic did not come from my head. It actually came from sitting down, listening to the music. The book was written in an apartment and was written very quickly, sitting down on a sofa with a desk in front of it. And then I put all the scholarly apparatus in after. Because if you look at it as things like opening chant and so on, so there was a way in which the text was feeling for a form in which was outside of the boundaries of the academy. Okay, so if you look at the closing chant, for example, is a page and a half, and it's really poetic. That's deliberately done, right? And that took the longest, quite frankly, to write, to get it right. So the questions of prophets really came out of listening to Marley, everything that Marley ever recorded. I have, paradigm speaker boxes, and I would turn them up very loud and just listen, not with headphones, just listen. Right? And it became clear to me as I was listening to him that this is a figure who was acting in a different way. And so it then meant reading about him. So you have to be listening to the music and then reading about him in as much a way and much a way as possible, deeper way as possible. You also have to understand, and this will be published in Boundary 2 in another 4 months. You also have to understand as part of my life where at high school I would slip out of classes to go to the studio, which was Sir Coxson's studio. And in Sir Coxsson was where Bob began to record, where Rastas were playing music. So my introduction as a middle class person, which is where I was born, to black working class musical forms was in that studio. Where as a little boy, I would just, 14, 15, I would just sit down and watch. And if somebody said, get me some water, I'd go and get the water and bring it in. All right? So that fascination for that kind of figure is a fascination about how does ordinary people or everyday people who are musicians, who come from a certain position in the class and racial codes of a society like Jamaica, how do they speak a certain language that actually resonates, that draws from the experience of the rural and the urban everyday people. And so so all those things were mixed up. So just listening, thinking about my time in the studio, thinking about my own life as a youngster in Jamaica, all of those things, and thinking about those young men. All of those things then consolidate themselves into the prophet. And once I began to think about prophet and prophecy within the black tradition, then because I'm a scholar, I then read every single thing that I could. And that then took me to South Africa and took me to the African continent. So if you read it, you will see there's a lot of references to that, but particularly to women prophetess. And that's because then you begin to read backwards. But you're reading backwards with all of this thing in your head, the music and so on. And what I think is important is then to understand that the prophet is really the figure who calls to order in a different language the system. He or she is not preaching revolution, unless it's a kind of revolution to chant the system down. Come chant down Babylon one more time, to use Marley's phrase. He or she is trying to think about the injustice of the system, the way the system is structured, and is therefore just calling it to order. Now, I am beginning to think, Malena and Will, that there are other forms of prophecy that we need to pay attention to. I mean, I'm just about finished writing an article on Mackendal in Haiti, and it turns out he was a prophet. He was not just poisoning people. That his speeches, when I look at the speeches that the colonial records said he gave, that he actually was a prophet, acting in a prophetic tradition. And he had a political objective. Let's kill all the white planters, set up a black state. That's what he had in his head. It's not clear to me. So that there are if I was doing that, I would actually have a different way. And there are also prophets, again, that coming out of Haiti, that were mixing voodoo and Islam. So again, in other words, if I was writing this now, I would begin to have a much broader remit of thinking about prophets within the black tradition. But I was very much Jamaica and Africa focused. And so this business of what I think is singular about the prophet is that the prophet actually comes from the everyday people and speaks the language of, and it may be a biblical language, or it may be a different kind of, it may be a Creole language, as in the way of Haiti or Sandama, but he or she speaks a language in which the objective is to call to order and to mobilize people and to create a different kind of human experience in that moment for the people who is preaching or for whom he's prophesying. Right? So I think that's what, or who she is prophesying. as well, because there are a couple of female prophets. So I mean, one of the it turns out the woman who was at the boys' camp on ceremony in Haiti, Cecile Fatima, that she died at 112 years old, and that she also was a prophet, not just bookman. But you need you need to go against the grain, right? You need to you take, because the convention now is bookman. So if you add Cecile Fatima to it, then you begin to say, okay, who is she? Because there are two of them. So who is she? And if you begin to trace that, then you come up with something else about who she is and her particular role. I smiled because this is. I must be getting old because people are asking me to do interviews about my life now. But I think that you are right to say that there is a tension between both, but it is not a contradictory tension that cannot be resolved.
Absolutely.
Right? This is, and the person, if you ask me, who I know resolves this best is Walter Rodney. I'm here speaking from the Caribbean, or Amilcar Cabral from Guinea-Bissau, from the African continent. And that is that you understand how you have been trained as an intellectual and as a scholar, the protocols of your formation. But you also understand that what you need to do if you are thinking about change and transformation and radical core critical activity. And it could be anything, I don't forget that Miles was trained at Juilliard, right? Is that you then need to begin to find a way in which you are linking to the everyday. Because what the protocols of the academy do, is that it takes you from the everyday. It presents you another protocol, embeds you within that protocol. And so for you to begin to think about the everyday and ordinary and everyday black people means that you have to break from that intellectually. And you have to overturn the categories that you have been taught, and you have to deliberately do so, because if you don't, they come back and they catch you by your throat, because that's how you have been trained. Okay? And so I think that somebody like a Walter constantly attempted to do this. And you could see it by the time he was writing his last book, where he does a remarkable job. It's about making of the guy in his working class. And he does a remarkable job in political economy and talking about the structures and etc. And in the last chapter in the book, he has a very funny sentence in which he says, you will never be able to get to understand the guy in his working class unless you understand their culture. And I thought, so you've written 300 pages, but then you say, something, this can't tell us the full story. Mm-hmm. And so to me, that's the way in which you can begin to understand and to see, understand everyday people, is to actually begin to think through questions of culture and practices. What it is that people are doing. And that to me, and therefore the question of culture as practice becomes really, and religion to me is part of that as well. And so that to me is really trying to develop methodologies that allow you to understand that. And I'm not talking here cultural anthropology, nor ethnographic questions and survey, but scholarly methods that require looking at different archives, and where possible, listening to those archives, but also listening to ordinary people and what they say. Mm. Not you talking over them, but listening and learning the language and beginning to understand the language in which they're saying what they are saying. Right? And I mean, and that was what Walter was, that was a gift that he had. And he called it, in, you know, Groundings with My Brothers, he called it Groundings. So that kind of relationship to the everyday, in my view, becomes really important if you really want to understand Black life. Absolutely, absolutely. If you don't do that to understand, try and understand that, then the everyday, then you get stuck. And then, before I come to semanticization, let me give you a concrete example of what I mean. For years, many of us have studied the Haitian Revolution, trying to take it out of the obscurity of the West. The best book on it so far is Michel Ralph Trujillo. But in looking at this revolution, we have been enchanted by Toussaint or Dessalines, some leader, Sanssouci, whoever. And even though there have been books like Carlin Fick's books about the Sandomar Revolution from below, we have not paid enough attention to the actual practices of what people were doing. When, over the last 2 years, I began to pay much more attention to that, which means also paying attention to voodoo songs as an archive and as a repertoire of practice. What has become clear to me, and it is in the article which I'm finishing, is that what you had was two revolutions. You had a slave revolution to end slavery, and then you had a national liberation struggle for independence. But from the beginning of the revolution, what the enslaved, both men and women, desired was the ending of plantation life as they knew it. Toussaint did not do that because he felt that he had to have the plantation. And he said, okay, you're not slaves anymore, we give you wages, etc. All the records I've been reading over the last 2 years tell me that people just did not turn up for work. Or they came very late, or they work for 2 days and then they don't work. And no matter how many labor codes he said, never happened. So what that tells me is that the hostility to the plantation itself as a symbol of your enslavement and of anti-black racism, that for ordinary enslaved people, that what they wanted to do was to get rid of it. Fully, they didn't want no plantation. What after, we can work it out, we don't want any plantation. And I think there are other reasons that have to do with questions of labor and so on, but I don't want to get into that now. If that is the terrain, that's the desires, the deepest desires that we can now see from all the actions and the catalogue of actions that the colonial people write, that the French people who stayed right and so on. Then, and the plantation is not gotten rid of. And then after political independence, the plantation is not gotten rid of again. Instead of what you get are new codes for labor laws and so on. Then can't we begin to say that after the dual revolution, revolution against slavery, revolution for national independence, because the plantation maintains itself as the singular source of economic and social life in the country, that the maintenance of that actually is the foundation for counter-revolution. And therefore, to begin to understand Haiti today, it may make sense to see that you have the revolution from 1791 up to 1805, when the Constitution is declared, for independence. And then, because the plantation is maintained both in the north and the south, what you then have is actually counter-revolution. And then you begin to have what I'm calling fragmented sovereignty. So what you begin to have, what Trujillo calls state versus nation. So what you begin to have is the state with its bureaucratic apparatuses and so on, and the revolutionary generals become bureaucrats, blah, blah, etc., and they have the state, and then what you have is the nation, is the peasants and the ordinary everyday nation. And in other words, they go off in two different directions, and in fragments. And if you put in the mix American occupation between 1915 and 1934 after, and so on, then the value, in 50s, you begin to understand the situation there in Haiti itself. So what is the point I'm making? Is this attention to what is it that everyday people want? What is it that everyday people are doing? How can we read that and read their practices to say, okay, this is, as scholars, to say this is what they're thinking. And therefore to say if we cannot have an analysis that says, okay, if this is what they're thinking and this still exists, then perhaps what you have is is in the Haitian case, what you have is actual counter-revolution that establishes itself. And that tells us how this is not a counter-revolution in which what now? In which there's a counter-revolution of an army coming to fight. This is a counter-revolution of the structures reinstalling themselves in certain ways, and people haven't died by the thousands saying, I ain't going there. No, I ain't going there. I'm going somewhere else. I'm going to do something else. Okay? So that is the way in which I'm thinking. Certainly we need to pay attention. Now I see that because I'm reading the voodoo songs. Now tell me, okay, I mean they have a genealogy to them. We come from Guinea in 1503. This is what happened to us, and this person did this, but this never really happened. And you begin to see this, and you begin to say, okay. And voodoo, and these are the oral texts of voodoo, because voodoo has no Bible, it has no written text. So it begins to tell you certain things if you read it, in a certain way, about what is it that people are thinking, which also tells you what, which also tells you, and here I think is where we can learn from Sylvia, it also tells you that the symbolic is actually the most important. Because that's what, people are describing as a kind of a history that is actually a symbolic history, with figures in it. Bookman, this person, that person, Guinea, so, but it is all about, all these names represent something, a set of histories, a set of practices, a set of oppressions, and so, and then people are trying to think, and that's how people think through them. Okay, so that's what I mean. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I think we can begin to think about it. And then within the United States, my argument is that the opening up of white supremacy and of forms of totalitarianism and authoritarianism, they have not gone away with the victory of Biden, that they are there. Secondly, that in the United States, under neoliberalism, what you have is that white supremacy has actually become fantasy. It's not just an ideology in the way, our belief that we understand it. Because you can't argue with it. You can't argue with somebody who, and it's really just struck me because I was having an argument years ago with a white person who supported the Iraq war but who was unemployed, but who was saying this is the greatest country in the world. And I thought, I don't quite get it. You have no job for about 5 years, you're on the street. there was a war going on and billions, and this is still, I mean, I don't get it's not in sync. And then it struck me that what he was talking from was not belief, it was from a fantasy that had been created. And you can't talk against a fantasy. You can't argue against it, right? I don't know what you can do against a fantasy. Friends have asked me, and I said, I don't know. But it would seem to me that what you have is the danger that we face is that the liberal politics of this time and the ways in which left, progressive, even radical black elements seem to now want to tether themselves to these liberal politics, which I understand because it creates a space, has left open a field of political practice for those who want to do authoritarianism. And so that has not gone away. White supremacy and authority has not been defeated. It's not just about Trump. It's about the dominant set of ideas about this country and why it was formed, how it was formed, for whom it was formed, and all those things. And so you're back to the symbolic. I hear people talk about the culture wars, that's trite. You're back to the symbolic, you're back to what is it that people believe, or people understand, how things are represented in people's imaginary, and so on. And what then, how we need to deal with that. I'm moving away quickly from the word phrase black critique.
Mm.
It was like it was a way in which I was trying to gather thoughts around black radical thinking. And this is the way the academic trains you. So I was thinking about black critical theory. So, if you look in my notebooks, you see that I was thinking about black critical theory. Then over time you see me cross it out and write black critique. And then you say I'll be giving talks like at Dartmouth on black critique and so on. And people say, oh, he's writing a book on black critique and so on and so forth. But increasingly I began to say that what I was doing was rushing down the wrong road. Rushing down the wrong road because I was drawing from Kant, and I was drawing from critical theory, and I was drawing from the Western way of thinking. And I was drawing from the way in which people define me as a critical theorist. So I said, you're rushing down the wrong road. And so what one wants to think about is just simple black radicality. What's black radicality? What does that mean? And radicality means the transformation, the uprooting, going back to its etymology. So what is that? And therefore think about a black radical tradition. Go back to where I started rather than to allow the academic game to cloud one's field of vision. Mm. And so in thinking about black radicalism and black radical thought, what one is thinking about is an alternative genealogy, quite frankly, to the West. That some of it, as I said before, may draw from the West, so, and the boys draw from the West, so James and so on. Sylvia Winter draw, all these people, right? But there is a moment in which you can no longer draw from the West because it has not got the intellectual resources to understand the world. The most important thinker of the West is Marx, radical thinker, in my view. Not Derrida, not Foucault, who I like a great deal. Not even Herbert Marcuse, who taught Angela. The most important person is Marx. But Marx does not have the key, A, and B, could not understand the world in the way the world was even constituted, because he didn't understand racial slavery, etc., etc. Right? So that therefore, you need to have a different set of intellectual resources, to have a different set of categories to begin to understand the world and the making of the modern world and what we are today. And that those intellectual resources actually come out of the black thought, radical black thought. Okay? I'll give you a concrete example of what I mean when I come back to heresy and prophecy. If you're thinking about revolution, there's all sorts of writings about revolution as political. Then there are some people who write that revolution is also social and political. And then there's Marx, who makes the point that because a revolution means changing the entire society, it is by itself can be social or is essentially social. What happens, but he's thinking about a class society. What happens when you have a society that is racially constructed, that is bound up in racial capitalism, that is bound up in questions of gender oppression? What happens when you have a society that is constructed that way? All those things are social things, but they are social things that have material effect because they create structures in a society, to use that word. And so that therefore any revolution is bound to be in those places, is bound to be social. It's not essentially social, it is bound to the logic of the revolution, is that it is going to raise the social question. And what is the social question? How do people live? Because societies are not just structures. Societies are about what? Are ensembles of relationships. If I alone live here or you alone live in the world, there's no society. It is the society is about an ensemble of living relationships that we form. Those relationships are mediated by race, by class, by gender, and by economic life, and so on and so on and so forth. Which means that in a society like this, you make the change or you make the revolution, you're bound to be social. It cannot be just political. It cannot be just economic. Because economic relationships themselves are relationships between people. They're not just up there in abstract. But how do you get to that? You get to that because of black life. That's what you cannot escape that if you are black life. If you're looking at black life, you're trying to understand blackness. You understand, this is, when the boys talk about the second side, what he should have also said is that you then understand the whole. In a way that other people don't understand the whole, not because they're dumb or evil, but because the historical experience does not create the ground for them to understand that whole. So that if you understand that whole, then you understand that the question, therefore, of all society is the social. If the questions of this is about the social, then the question is about what we are as human beings. And how can we live together? And very importantly, the questions of the ecology is about that too. Because it is about at what point in our history of the species, and it was the colonialists who did this, it's not us, it was what point in the history of the species did we transform our understanding of nature for it to become matter that we could bend. Rather than finding ways in which we can live with what, that we too are part of this. That animals are, that there is a life, that we are human, but there is a life that we have in relationship to the world in which the earth that we all inhabit, to the animals that we have, the kingdom, the animal life that surrounds us, to the plant life that surrounds us. All of that is what? Is a reassessment of the social, but in reassessing that social is also a reassessment of what we are as human beings and how we can live together. That's the heart of that's what the black radical tradition does. The black radical tradition, if you follow it through, takes us to that. Takes us to this question of the human. Not the humanism of the Renaissance, but the question of the human as a possibility of how we can live together and how we must live, which is not the humanism of the Renaissance. So to me, that is the heart. That's the heart of not being a Negro. That's the heart of blackness. Because I think that we have not. It is an archive that we have ignored. B is a language that we have not paid attention to, and C that we don't see it as a site. Many of us don't see it as a site of offering a different kind of way for us to think about human life. We see it as a site of resistance. We see it as a tremendous cultural site and so on, remarkable and with lots of creativity and so on. But how do you draw? Let me put this another way. How do you draw from time after time? How do you draw from the work of Coltrane? How do you draw from the work of Nina Simone? How do you draw from the work of our sister Aretha Franklin? How do you draw from that a certain way, for the want of a better word, a certain philosophical understanding of what being human is about? Because I would want to argue that all of them are doing that in their own ways. So Aretha is not just about the black church and the centrality of the black church to African American life and female singing and choirs and so on and so on and so forth. She's actually going through a set of pains. She's also talking about a certain kind of way in which we can live. Even if she herself doesn't follow it, I don't expect people to follow what they say. Right? But there is, because we are fallible, we're not perfect. But the ways in which Aretha can scream out the question of respect tells you something about the quality of human life that we need to think about. The way in which Mavis Staples can sing "I'll Take You There," right? With her father, Pops, playing that guitar in the back, tells you about a possibility that is different from where we are. So it's just trying to understanding those things and understanding the language that the Sonic is telling is I use language, but I hear some people use grammar. It's fine. But understanding what that now tells us in all its richness, to me, is a way for us to begin to understand black life as well. Yeah, I mean, I can only describe it because it's all right, so last night, for example, I was trying to put in the subheads to the Haitian article. And somebody sent me something, and I clicked onto it just, because I usually click onto what this person says. And that click led me to another set of music. And I stopped putting in the subheads. And I began to listen. And actually, when you're listening on your iPad, there's an X-ray lyrics that comes up sometimes, so some songs, not for everything. And so I was actually reading and listening. So it was a simultaneous thing. And that went on for 2 hours, and I had to say to myself, okay, no, you have to stop now. You have a deadline for this thing. because when I do that, I can actually go on to 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and I will lose track of time. I said, no, you have a deadline. You tell the people you get it to them this week. So it's, I mean, I find it difficult to answer, because for me it is, I don't have an answer. What I do know is that it allows me to get deeply into the sound and the lyrics, and to kind of read both simultaneously, and to listen and read simultaneously. And almost like doing a double listening, quite frankly. Right? And that it is, it has to be done at a certain frequency as well. So it can't be done just with the sound that comes out of the iPad. It has to be done with the JBL bass hooked onto the iPad, so you can listen a certain way. But what I think it does is that it then allows one to think differently, particularly if you're writing. Now, if you're writing something on the Haitian thing and you're trying to do mechanical things, okay, let me put the subhead. It's not. But if you're writing something else, right, it becomes, I think, a little different. So let me give you. Push forward a question. When I'm writing the chapter on Lee Scratch Perry, talk to me, because then I would have saturated myself so much that I can probably describe that process.